The first thing I felt was the stiffness in my left shoulder, a heavy reminder of the fall that brought me here. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the ceiling lights above me hummed in a steady, cold rhythm. I kept my eyes half closed, trying to judge how long I'd been asleep, when a voice slipped through the cracked door. It was my daughter's. Her tone wasn't soft or worried. It was sharp, hurried, as if she was trying to press something through before someone returned. The tension in her voice pushed a small pulse of unease through my chest, steady and cold. She spoke in fragments at first, something about urgency, something about needing this done before he gets too tired again. Each word clipped the air like she was afraid of being overheard. I stayed still, listening to the sound of her steps pacing in the hallway. The rhythm of her shoes against the tile was too quick for someone visiting an injured parent. It carried impatience, not concern. I tried shifting my hand slightly under the blanket to test my strength, but the movement sent a dull ache up my arm, reminding me I wasn't in any condition to confront anyone. The door eased open without warning, barely an inch, then two. A man stepped in. My lawyer, Alan. He closed the door behind him with careful hands, avoiding the usual hospital stiffness that comes from rushed visits. His eyes scanned the room before landing on mine. He didn't greet me. He didn't even exhale. He walked to my bedside with the kind of tension a man carries when he's already crossed a line simply by entering. His tie was slightly crooked, and for the first time in the 10 years I'd known him, he looked rattled. Alan leaned down, as if adjusting the blanket near my side, but his voice reached me in a whisper so thin it barely moved the air. "Don't sign the will amendment she brought." The words were stripped of formality, stripped of legal caution. They sounded like a warning you'd give someone standing too close to a steep ledge. His eyes flicked to the door as soon as he finished, and he straightened up quickly, pretending to check the clipboard hanging at the foot of the bed. The urgency in his face told me everything he couldn't risk saying out loud. Whatever my daughter brought wasn't a simple update or suggestion. It was something dangerous enough that a seasoned lawyer felt the need to deliver his message like a man dodging shadows. His expression held worry, not for himself, but for what it meant for me. I tried asking what she wanted me to sign, but the words caught behind my teeth when he subtly shook his head, telling me silence was safer. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, her silhouette shifted again. She was pacing, pausing, checking her phone, then pacing again. The faint shape of her raised hand told me she was tapping her nails against her arm, something she only did when she was anxious or waiting for something to fall into place. The hallway lights cast her figure in a pale blur, but even that blur carried a strange impatience, almost like she expected a signature to solve a problem I didn't know existed. The outline of her movement felt wrong in a way I couldn't yet name. Alan stepped back, lowering his voice even further. "I shouldn't be here long." His gaze moved across the ceiling corners, as if imagining microphones tucked inside the vents. I'd never seen him act like this. He was a man who handled estate disputes, medical power of attorney forms, and asset transfers with the calm of a surgeon. But now, he looked like someone trying to avoid being overheard in a hostile room. The tension in his face didn't match the quiet hospital setting around us. He adjusted his glasses and took one step toward the door. "I'll come back when she leaves," he said under his breath, though the line between promise and hope in his tone was thin. When he cracked the door open, my daughter's silhouette snapped into stillness, as though she'd been waiting for the exact sound of that hinge. Her shadow leaned slightly forward, a posture she used when she was impatient to take control of a moment. I let my eyes drift shut just as he slipped out. The room settled back into its steady hum, and the cool air brushed against my face. Her footsteps grew louder, slow and deliberate now, losing the urgency from moments before. I steadied my breathing as she came in, pretending I was resting, pretending I hadn't heard a thing. She walked toward me with a smile that felt practiced, the kind someone puts on when they've already decided what they need you to agree to. The chair beside my bed creaked as she settled into it, the sound too casual for the tension she carried in her shoulders. Her smile stayed fixed, but the space behind her eyes looked busy, almost crowded with thoughts she didn't want slipping out. I kept my breathing slow, steady, hoping the act of resting would give me a moment to understand what was happening. The hospital blanket weighed lightly against my legs, and the tightness in my arm reminded me how easily a fall could change the rhythm of a man's life. I waited for her to speak first, just to hear the tone she chose. She reached for the water cup on the tray, adjusting it for no real reason, and her voice came out with a softness I didn't remember from her. It had been years since I heard her talk, like someone trying to sound gentle. Being a widower for nearly a decade had taught me how to sit in long stretches of quiet, how to accept distance without making a wound out of it. I lived alone in a small, steady house, retired from my job as a bus inspector, content with my routines. She visited on holidays, sometimes a birthday, sometimes not. The gap between us had grown so naturally that her sudden sweetness now felt strangely out of place. Her concern had surfaced right after she learned about the medical tests I'd been scheduled for. She called 3 times in one day, something she hadn't done even when her mother died. Each call carried a warm tone that sounded copied from a script, smooth around the edges, in a way her real voice never was. When she arrived at my house the next morning, she moved through the rooms as if she were checking for hazards rather than memories. It struck me as too quick, too efficient, as if she'd been preparing for this shift long before I knew about the tests myself. I remembered the comments she sprinkled into conversations over the past year, small remarks dressed up as concern. "Maybe it's time to simplify things," she'd say while looking around the living room. Or, "Big houses aren't safe for old men." She said it with a smile, a half-joke to soften the sting, but the words sat with me longer than they should have. I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I just listened the way older men do when they know age is slowly collecting its debt. I didn't think her remarks meant anything more than impatience. But sitting here now, the pattern felt clearer than I wanted to admit. Over the next few days, she began taking over small parts of my life without waiting for my permission. She scheduled my doctor's appointments before telling me about them. She organized my medications, placing them into color-coded boxes I never asked for. She gathered my mail, sorting through it with a seriousness that made me feel like a spectator in my own home. When I asked her why she was handling all this, she shrugged and said, "You shouldn't have to worry about these things anymore." The line sounded thoughtful, but her eyes held something firmer, something closer to authority than care. Now, sitting beside my hospital bed, that same firmness kept slipping through her expressions. She glanced at the whiteboard where the nurses wrote my status updates, studying the notes with an interest that felt clinical rather than emotional. Her questions for the staff were quick and specific. She wanted dates, signatures, copies. It was as if the details of the hospital mattered more to her than the bruise on my ribs or the soreness in my hip. Each time a nurse entered, her posture shifted into something alert, like she was trying to track every piece of information that passed through the room. The quiet moment I used to enjoy in hospitals, the simple stillness after a fall, the accepting pause life sometimes forces, was gone, replaced instead by her presence, her calculations, her sudden investment in every form and every clipboard. It made the air feel tighter. I couldn't shake the image of my lawyer's face from earlier, that unsettled look he tried to hide behind professional control. The whisper he gave me was still sharp in my mind, sharper now that I saw her moving through the room with such practiced confidence. A question settled into my thoughts, with a weight I didn't try to ignore. Why would a lawyer need to warn a father about his own daughter? And why now, at a moment when I should have been able to rely on the person carrying my last name? I noticed the shift the next morning when she returned with a folder tucked under her arm, her steps lighter than yesterday, as if something had moved in her favor overnight. She sat by my bed and spoke in a calm, practiced tone, telling me the hospital needed updated will forms for procedural reasons. She explained it like she was doing me a favor, smoothing her voice over the edges of the request so it would sound harmless. I nodded as if I accepted it, but a quiet part of me stayed alert. Hospitals didn't handle wills. They barely handled billing without 3 reminders. Her explanation settled into my thoughts like a mismatched puzzle piece. Later that day, a nurse came in to adjust the monitor leads on my chest. She worked with gentle, distracted hands, humming softly under her breath. She glanced at my chart and mentioned, almost casually, that my daughter had been asking about end-of-life documentation. The words didn't land with the weight the nurse intended, but they landed. I kept my face still, forcing the quiet of an old man who didn't want to admit he'd heard. The nurse continued her work without noticing the shift in me. I stared at the ceiling, letting the phrase echo in the sterile air. End of life wasn't something my daughter and I had ever spoken about. Hearing it secondhand felt like discovering a door in my own house I didn't know existed. She returned a few hours later with her usual brisk energy, setting her bag on the chair. When she stepped out to take a call, I shifted slightly, testing the reach of my good arm. The zipper on her bag sat partly open. Inside, a thick envelope rested against the edge, its tab half slipped out. A small section of the label was visible, printed neatly in blue ink. Estate Transition Packet. I stared at it long enough for the room's hum to fade. The title didn't belong in a daughter's hospital bag, any more than a scalpel belonged in a child's backpack. I leaned back before she returned, keeping my breathing calm, steady, old. When she walked in again, she started speaking before the door even closed, talking about my morning tests. She sounded informed, almost overly so, as if she had already rehearsed her answers. When the doctor arrived a few minutes later, she stepped into the conversation with a confidence that didn't match the situation. She told him I'd been having memory issues, said it lightly, as if it were a small detail she needed to slip into the record. The doctor looked at me, direct, professional, and asked a few measured questions. I answered clearly. He nodded, satisfied. She avoided my eyes, smoothing the sleeve of her blouse instead. She stayed close after that. Close enough to hear every exchange, close enough to speak before I did. When my phone buzzed on the tray, she reached for it faster than I could lift my hand. She glanced at the caller ID, pressed the side button to silence it, and set it face down with a brief, controlled motion. Spam, she said simply. The explanation was so flat, it didn't even attempt to sell itself. I didn't ask who it was. I simply watched the stiffness in her fingers as she placed the phone back on the tray. Visitors I expected never arrived. A neighbor texted, asking if he could stop by, but when I mentioned it out loud, she said the hospital wasn't allowing guests that day. The rule changed again when she stepped out to get coffee. A nurse asked whether I wanted someone added to the approved visitor list. The contradiction sat with me again. The pattern forming around me wasn't made of loud moments. It was built from small deviations, quiet shifts in her explanations, things that didn't align when placed side by side. From my bed, I began watching her with a patience that came naturally at my age. I noticed how her eyes tracked the charts before they tracked me. I noticed how her hand hovered near my phone whenever it buzzed. I noticed how her smile appeared only when someone entered the room, disappearing the moment their back turned. Each detail added a small weight to something forming in the center of my awareness. None of it pointed anywhere final yet, but it pointed somewhere, and that was enough to make me look at her differently. The room had settled into its late afternoon quiet when she stepped out to talk to a nurse down the hall. I used the stillness the way older men use time, slowly without wasting a second. My phone lay where she'd placed it earlier, screen dimmed, battery low. I lifted it carefully, scrolling through my banking app, a habit I'd kept since my retirement. The login history showed 3 recent attempts at hours I remembered clearly. One while I was at a physical therapy session, one during the ambulance ride, and one late at night when I'd been sedated. My hands remained steady, but a cold, controlled realization spread through me. Someone had been trying to access accounts I never shared. I locked the screen and returned the phone to its place just as her footsteps approached. She walked in with an air of certainty, like someone who had already arranged the next 5 steps of a plan. Her bag hung loosely from her shoulder, and when she set it down, a stack of papers slipped to the side. She didn't notice. When she moved to adjust the window blinds, I tilted my head enough to see the top sheet. Printed property deed information with my address highlighted. Under it, a page from my pension file. The edges were crisp, recently printed. I stared at the documents long enough to memorize the layout, then shifted my gaze to keep my breathing even when she turned back. A few minutes later, she called for a nurse, asking about the requirements for establishing power of attorney. She framed the question with concern, letting her voice carry a gentle tremor, as though she were a daughter trying to handle responsibilities she never wanted. The nurse answered politely, unaware of the motive beneath the surface. I watched the way my daughter nodded, storing each detail like someone collecting instructions rather than information. Her eyes flicked toward me once, quick, measuring, before she slipped the conversation into casual territory again. She came back to my bedside and adjusted the head of my bed without asking if I needed it. The mechanical lift hummed softly as she pressed the button, tilting me upward. Her hand lingered on the controls, almost protective, but the gesture felt more like she was reinforcing her position than helping my comfort. She checked the small medication reminder card the hospital kept on the tray, flipping it over as if inspecting whether the timing matched her expectations. When a nurse walked in briefly to ask how I was feeling, my daughter answered for me, using a tone that suggested I was tired, confused, and better off resting. The nurse accepted the reply and left without further questions. Later, while pretending to read a pamphlet about fall prevention, she stepped into the hallway to take a call. Her voice was low, but the words carried through the thin door. "Once it's finalized, things will move smoothly," she said. There was no softness in her tone this time, no caregiving pretense. She spoke with the ease of someone coordinating logistics, not offering support. I heard a faint response from the other end, too muffled to identify. But the conversation had a rhythm that didn't belong to a family matter. It sounded like two people preparing for a transaction. When she returned, her expression was neutral again, calm in a practiced way. She sat back down, opened a small notebook, and started jotting something. I watched her hand glide across the page, each note brief and precise. The deliberate nature of her movements carried a familiar edge. It reminded me of the way she handled things when she wanted to present a case, not when she wanted to offer care. Throughout the rest of the evening, she hovered near my interactions, positioning herself so she could catch every word exchanged between me and the staff. When a physical therapist came in to discuss mobility exercises, she interjected with comments about my forgetfulness and recent slipping. She said it lightly, almost playfully, but the implication fell straight into the therapist's notes. The phrasing had shifted from occasional uncertainty to something closer to a pattern. She wasn't describing my condition. She was building a narrative about my capacity. I listened to her with a calm that came from age, not acceptance. Her behavior wasn't loud or frantic. It was organized. Each step connected to the last, forming something I wasn't meant to see. But I had seen enough small details in the world to recognize when someone was preparing a story before the truth had a chance to speak for itself, and she was preparing one now. The lawyer returned near dusk, slipping into the room with the same careful steps he used during his first warning. He didn't sit this time. He kept his back angled toward the door, one hand inside his coat as if steadying something. When he finally met my eyes, the look he carried was heavier, more certain. He unfolded a small packet of documents and placed them near my tray without letting them touch my daughter's belongings. His voice was low, tense in the way a man sounds when he knows the truth is about to wound someone. "The hospital didn't request anything," he said. "No amendments, no updates. Whatever she brought wasn't from them." I let the words settle, feeling the weight of them rather than reacting. The papers he set down were copies of internal emails he had requested, confirming no department had contacted family members for estate information. The clarity in that evidence left no room for interpretation. The amendment she claimed was routine had come from somewhere else, and whoever prepared it had expected I'd trust her without question. My breathing stayed slow, the controlled pace of a man absorbing a blow he knew was coming, but had hoped to avoid. The lawyer gave a barely perceptible nod, then stepped back toward the door, as if expecting interruption. He didn't get far. My daughter entered as he was leaving, greeting him with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She moved past him quickly, placing her purse on the chair beside me. Her voice softened when she turned toward my bed, asking again if I had looked over the papers. She spoke as if everything was routine, as if she weren't threading these requests through my most vulnerable moments. I gave a small, neutral answer, enough to keep her steady while I observed her. When she bent down to adjust the blanket near my side, something slipped from her purse and fell quietly onto the floor. She didn't hear it. After she stepped into the bathroom to wash her hands, I shifted just enough to see what had dropped. A bundle of practice sheets, torn from a legal pad, lay fanned across the tile. My own signature was repeated across them. Crooked, uneven versions of my name, some close, some far off, all of them familiar enough that someone might not look twice if they weren't paying attention. I slid the papers beneath the blanket with the edge of my foot, just as she opened the door again. Her tone had shifted when she returned to my side. The practiced sweetness thinned, replaced with an urgency she was trying to hide. She reminded me again about the medical urgency of signing, saying delays could cause complications with my care. The phrase didn't match anything the doctors had told me. It was the kind of line someone uses when they expect a signature to unlock something more important than a hospital form. She looked around the room as she spoke, her foot tapping lightly against the floor, a quiet signal of impatience I had seen during her childhood when she wanted something quickly. As the evening drew on, her restraint began to fray. She sat closer, leaning in with a tone that edged toward frustration. She mentioned how much she had given up already to be here, how the situation was taking a toll, how she needed things to be settled. She kept her voice low, not angry, but strained enough that the pretense of pure concern slipped. Her frustration wasn't rooted in worry about my health. It was rooted in delays, in paperwork still unsigned, in the sense that she was losing time she thought she had control over. After a round of tests later that night, the sedative left a haze in my mind, slowing my thoughts by a half step. Through that fog, I felt her guiding my hand toward the clipboard near the bed. Her voice was soft, urging, steadying my fingers as if she were helping a child complete homework. Even in the haze, something inside me pulled back. I shifted enough to break her grip, pretending the movement was discomfort from the IV line. She withdrew her hand with a sigh, masking the irritation with a thin layer of sympathy. When the sedative wore off, clarity returned in a sharp, unmistakable line. Her words, her documents, her attempts, all of it pointed to a truth she hadn't spoken aloud. I wasn't her father in this setting. I was an obstacle, a financial weight she was trying to move, a final piece she needed to shift her life into some alignment she thought she deserved. The realization didn't come with anger. It came with a quiet, grounded certainty, a kind of understanding that forms when a man sees the truth without the blindness of hope. The morning began with a kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. A nurse entered first, checking my vitals with a focus that felt heavier than the numbers on the monitor. She avoided small talk, kept her eyes on the chart, and left with a brief nod. A few minutes later, the hospital lawyer returned, this time with a social worker at his side. Their presence together carried a weight that didn't need explanation. They stood near the foot of my bed, speaking with the calm tone professionals use when the truth is serious enough to require steady delivery. The lawyer set a folder on the tray, but didn't open it. He said my daughter had attempted to submit documents to the hospital administration the night before, forms claiming changes to my decision-making authority. He spoke clearly, without judgment, but the simplicity of his words landed like cold metal. The social worker added that the paperwork had been flagged as unauthorized. My signature didn't match. The hospital held it until they could verify my condition. I listened without blinking, letting each detail carve itself into place. Before they left, the lawyer leaned slightly closer. Keeping his voice low, he advised that I not be left alone with her until everything was reviewed. There was no dramatic pause, no emphasis. It was a direct recommendation delivered by a man who did not offer warnings lightly. The social worker confirmed she had already informed the nursing staff. Their tone remained clinical, but the message was unmistakable. The danger was no longer a suspicion. It was documented. Not long after they stepped out, my phone buzzed with an automated alert from the bank. I opened it slowly, reading the notification twice. There had been an attempted change to my account's access settings for my safety. The phrase was identical to one my daughter had used the day before when adjusting my medication reminder card. The bank blocked the request and marked it for review. My chest tightened, not from panic, but from the steady recognition that the pattern extended further than I imagined. When a resident doctor came to check on me, he scrolled through the digital notes attached to my file. He hesitated for a moment, then asked if I was aware someone had been requesting updates about tests I wasn't even scheduled for. He didn't accuse, he simply presented the information. According to the notes, my daughter had asked about my neurological evaluations, my cognitive assessments, and my capacity reports, categories that required permission I had never given. His tone remained even, but the details formed a clear outline. She wasn't just collecting information. She was preparing a case. A nurse later confirmed another detail while adjusting the IV line. My daughter had claimed I was no longer mentally fit to track my own care. The phrase had been entered into the system during a conversation she initiated with staff. Hearing it spoken aloud, in a sterile room with machines clicking in steady intervals, stripped away any lingering hope that this was a misunderstanding. She wasn't reacting to fear or worry. She was constructing a narrative with purpose behind it. Throughout the day, staff entered with an extra layer of caution, checking my ID band twice, verifying each decision directly with me. Their politeness carried a subtle alertness, the kind people use when they're trying to protect someone without making the situation louder. I stayed calm, letting the clarity settle. Fear didn't come in a rush. It came as a steady recognition that the ground beneath me had shifted. And once it shifted, there was no returning to the version of events I had been trying to believe. Late in the afternoon, the lawyer returned alone. He stood near the door, glancing once into the hallway before speaking. He repeated his earlier warning, firmer this time. Do not let myself be isolated with her. His tone was soft but final. This wasn't precaution anymore. This was the point where the situation crossed from concern into confirmed threat. When he left, the room felt different, not darker, just clearer. The pieces that had been scattered across small moments, offhand remarks, misplaced documents, forged pages, and borrowed sympathy had aligned into a single, unmistakable shape. Whatever came next would not be a misunderstanding. The morning felt unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that settles in when everyone understands there's more happening beneath the surface than the room reveals. I used the early hours to secure what I could. With the help of the hospital lawyer, I confirmed every account, reset passwords, added temporary locks, and asked the staff to document any interaction involving my name or decisions. Each step was slow, methodical, the steady work of a man rebuilding a boundary he didn't know had been breached. I signed the hospital's protection forms with a clear mind, my hand steady, the pen leaving clean strokes across the page. For the first time in days, I felt a small thread of control tightening back into place. She arrived shortly after, moving quickly through the doorway, as if she'd been waiting for the exact moment the nurse stepped out. Her eyes moved around the room with a restless energy, scanning every surface as though expecting to see something out of place. She carried a folder again, gripped tighter this time, and the smile she attempted looked thin around the edges. She asked about the documents she'd given me, her tone polite but strained. When I didn't immediately answer, she shifted her weight, tapping her fingers lightly against the bed rail, a habit she never had when she was calm. Her questions grew sharper as the day went on. She approached nurses with impatience, pressing for explanations about procedures she didn't understand, insisting on details she wasn't authorized to hear. More than once, I heard her raise her voice outside my room, not in anger, but in agitation, as if her timeline was slipping. She paced the hallway often enough that one of the aides quietly closed my door to give me privacy. Even then, I could still hear the sound of her shoes going back and forth, a steady, anxious rhythm that chipped at the remaining calm in the air. She continued filtering my calls, picking up my phone before I could reach it, telling people I was too tired, too confused, or not up for company. Visitors who planned to stop by never made it to my room. When a neighbor tried again, she met them near the elevators and redirected them with practiced concern. Each interception tightened the circle around me, making the room feel smaller every time she walked in. By mid-afternoon, I decided it was time to apply a quiet test, not to accuse her, but to watch her reaction. I waited until she settled into the chair beside me, her leg bouncing with nervous energy. In a calm voice, I mentioned that the hospital administration had requested a meeting with me privately, saying they needed to confirm some details before moving forward. The moment the words left my mouth, her posture changed. She froze. Her eyes widened just enough to reveal the fear she'd been hiding under layers of control. She asked who contacted me, when the meeting was, what it involved, her questions tumbling out too quickly. Her breathing shifted, shallow and uneven, and she stood up as if ready to march out and intercept someone she hadn't even identified yet. I watched her without reacting, letting her fill the silence with explanations that contradicted each other. She insisted the hospital always included family in those meetings, then claimed they rarely held them at all. She said she had already handled everything, then claimed nothing had been processed yet. Her panic wasn't loud. It was tight, contained, but unmistakable. The test had revealed exactly what it needed to. A nurse entered during her spiral of half-answers, and the sudden shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. The nurse's eyes flicked between us, reading the tension with the subtle skill of someone trained to recognize risk. She stayed longer than necessary, checking the monitor twice, asking me direct questions with my daughter standing only inches away. Her presence was deliberate. Another staff member passed by the doorway moments later, slowing just enough to observe. They were watching now, not out of curiosity, but out of awareness. My daughter noticed it too. Her movements stiffened, her voice dropping to a lower, more careful tone. She tried to regain her smile, but it slipped every time she glanced toward the hallway. The control she had been building piece by piece was starting to erode, and she sensed it. As the evening light thinned across the room, I felt a quiet resolve form inside me. Not anger, not bitterness, just the certainty that the moment for truth was approaching. The pattern was complete. Her behavior had reached a place she could no longer hide with polite explanations or rushed sympathy. The calm was ending, and whatever came next would require clarity, not hope. She slipped into the room close to midnight, closing the door with a soft click that felt louder than any alarm. The hallway lights behind her cast a thin outline around her figure, and for a moment she just stood there, holding a stack of documents against her chest. Her expression didn't carry the usual performance of concern. It was tighter, sharper, stripped of the gentleness she had used to guide me through the last few days. She stepped closer, placing the papers on my tray with a quick, deliberate motion. "These can't wait anymore," she said. "They need your signature tonight." I didn't reach for the pen. The room remained steady and quiet, except for the hum of the machines beside me. Her foot tapped against the tile, a restless pattern that matched the strain in her voice. She insisted that the situation was urgent, that delays were making everything harder. Her tone skipped past worry and landed in irritation, the kind that comes from losing a grip she thought she already had. When I stayed still, she exhaled through her teeth, pacing once at the foot of the bed before turning back to me with eyes full of resentment she no longer tried to hide. "You're ruining everything," she whispered, her voice trembling with frustration rather than sorrow. "I've handled everything for you. Your home, your bills, all the things you can't manage anymore. And you're making this impossible." She stepped closer, reaching for my phone on the tray with a quick, possessive motion. Before her fingers reached it, I covered the device with my hand. Her jaw tightened, and she tried to turn the gesture into a smile, but the strain around her mouth betrayed her. She reached for the small medication cup at my bedside next, lifting it slightly as if testing the weight. "You missed your dose earlier," she said. "Let me help." Her voice carried an edge of urgency she couldn't mask. I kept my hand steady on the tray, watching her movements with the calm awareness of someone who had already seen enough. She set the cup down abruptly when she realized I wasn't giving her access to anything she could use. I shifted slightly, reaching for the folder the lawyer had left earlier. Her eyes narrowed when she saw it, recognizing the shape before the contents. I opened it slowly, laying out the memos from the hospital, the screenshots of the access logs from my accounts, and the written notes confirming her unauthorized filings. The papers sat between us like a barrier she hadn't expected to face. Her breath caught, and the panic she'd tried to suppress all day broke through in a sharp, uncontrolled expression. "What is all this?" she asked, though she already knew. Her hands hovered above the documents, shaking. She picked up one page, scanned it, then tossed it back onto the tray with a shaky laugh that didn't match any real humor. "You don't understand how complicated things are. I was trying to help. You leave everything undone. Someone had to take responsibility." Her words tumbled out, rapid and uneven, the polished concern gone. She grabbed another sheet, then another, tearing at the corners as if destroying the evidence could undo the past week. Her movements grew more frantic, her breath uneven as she tried to swipe the papers into her bag. A few fell to the floor. She reached for them with a sharp jerk of her arm, muttering about fixing this, and no choice left. The raised voices echoed just enough to break the silence of the hallway. The bed rails vibrated as she bumped against them, the sound sharp in the still room. A nurse appeared in the doorway after a few seconds, her expression alert and focused. "Is everything all right in here?" she asked, stepping inside before either of us answered. She glanced at the scattered papers, then at my daughter's strained posture, and her face tightened with understanding. Another staff member approached behind her, drawn by the commotion, and positioned himself near the doorway, in quiet readiness. My daughter froze when she realized they were watching. For a moment, her expression shifted into something cold and flat, something I had not seen on her before. Then she straightened, trying to compose herself. but the attempt was hollow. The tension in the room had already revealed what she wanted to keep hidden. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply gathered the nearest page from the tray and held it steady in my hand. She saw what was written on it, the memo confirming the forged amendment, and her eyes flicked away, as if the truth itself burned to look at. A quiet distance settled between us, deeper than anger, wider than fear. Whatever she had been building collapsed in that space, leaving her standing in the remains of a plan she could no longer control. Security entered first, speaking in calm tones meant to steady a room already frayed at the edges. They asked my daughter to step back from the bed, and when she hesitated, one of them gently positioned himself between us. The scattered documents on the tray and floor told most of the story without needing my voice. A supervisor arrived moments later, took statements, and recorded the condition of every page. The incident was logged before she could frame a single explanation. She stood rigid, unable to rebuild the mask she'd worn the past week. The police arrived not long after, their presence quiet rather than forceful. They spoke with me first, sitting at eye level, letting me recount only what I felt steady enough to share. They asked simple, direct questions, noting dates, times, and actions without pressure. My lawyer arrived midway through, adding context where needed, handing them the memos, the access logs, and the hospital's documentation. My daughter watched the process with a hollow stillness, her earlier urgency drained into a flat disbelief that her plan had become evidence. When the officers finally turned to her, the conversation shifted into a different register, measured, professional, unavoidable. The charges were explained in clear language: fraud, coercion, attempted exploitation of an elderly patient. Each one landed with a weight that settled the room into a somber quiet. She didn't argue. She didn't deny. She simply stared at the floor as if trying to make sense of a path she had thought she controlled. The officers asked her to gather her things. She lifted her bag without meeting my eyes and walked out with them in a slow, uneven motion, leaving behind the last traces of the story she'd been trying to write on my behalf. Once she was gone, the hospital lawyer stayed to finalize the immediate protections. He placed new forms on my tray, documents that restored every authority she had tried to undermine. I signed them one by one, the strokes steady, the decisions clear. He assured me the courts would hold her filings void, that my property, accounts, and medical decisions were back under my control. There was no triumph in his voice, just the steady professionalism of a man closing a door that should never have been opened. Later, the bank called directly through the nurse's station. A representative confirmed the attempted access changes had been reversed completely. My accounts were locked to external edits, and a fraud investigation was underway. Their tone was respectful, careful, aware of the circumstances. When the call ended, a nurse approached to inform me the hospital had placed a permanent restriction on my daughter. No visits, no calls, no access to my information. The decision was final. It brought no relief, only a quiet acknowledgement of where things now stood. The room felt different afterward. Not safer, just clearer. The weight of betrayal settled into my chest with a heaviness that didn't need explanation. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel shock. I felt the quiet kind of sorrow that comes when a truth finally stops hiding. There was no space left for denial, no reason to soften what had happened. The daughter I raised had chosen a path that placed my life beneath her plans. Understanding that didn't require rage. It required acceptance. Over the next day, I began the slow process of rebuilding what she had tried to rearrange. I reviewed my estate with the lawyer, simplifying what I could, placing my affairs into safer hands, creating boundaries that should have existed long before this. I asked for hard copies, secure accounts, and automatic protections I had never considered necessary at my age. Each decision was deliberate, free of haste, shaped by the clarity the past week had forced upon me. When night came again, the room felt quieter than before. Not empty, just honest. The machines hummed steadily, the hallway lights dimmed, and I lay still, letting the full weight of the betrayal rest where it belonged. In truth, not memory. There was no reunion to imagine, no conversation left to revisit, only the steady work of living forward with eyes open. The days after everything settled felt quieter than I expected, not peaceful, just honest in a way life becomes when the noise finally leaves the room. I spent long hours thinking about the path that led here, replaying the moments I brushed aside as harmless. The truth came slowly, like old memories rising from storage. I had ignored signs because love makes a man soften edges that should stay sharp. I excused small remarks, overlooked sudden interest, trusted gestures that didn't feel natural. I let myself believe distance could turn into care overnight. It took almost losing everything to admit how deeply I wanted to see the daughter I remembered, not the woman standing in front of me. Age has a way of making a man think he's survived enough to recognize danger. But entitlement doesn't arrive like a storm. It grows quietly. It begins with suggestions disguised as help, then slips into decisions made on your behalf, and finally builds into a structure where your life becomes paperwork someone else wants to control. I saw pieces of it over the last few years, but I tried to explain them away. I told myself she was busy, that I was old-fashioned, that her tone didn't mean what it clearly did. It's a strange thing, how the people you raise can begin to see your aging not as a season of care, but as an opportunity. Once that shift happens, love cannot stop the momentum. Lying in that hospital bed, I understood something I wish I had known earlier. Instincts don't lie. They only whisper. They give you a tug in the chest, a tightening in the air, a sense that something is off even when words look polite. I felt those whispers. I brushed them aside because fathers do that. We think protecting our children includes protecting them from our suspicions. But ignoring truth is not love. It is surrender. And surrender opens doors that should remain locked. In the days that followed, I secured every document, every account, every decision that carried my name. It wasn't paranoia. It was responsibility. I learned that control over your life is not something you hand away, even to the people you trust most, especially to them. Paperwork may look simple, but it can hold the power to erase decades of your autonomy. A signature made in a moment of weakness can reshape your entire future. That reality doesn't need fear, just awareness. Healing, I've learned, doesn't come from repairing relationships that broke themselves. It doesn't come from reaching back for someone who stepped away from you willingly. Healing comes from boundaries, firm, quiet, steady boundaries that protect what remains of your life. I didn't seek reconciliation. I didn't chase explanations. I let the truth stand exactly where it fell. Sometimes that is the purest form of peace an older man can choose. Acceptance, not forgiveness. Distance, not resentment. Clarity, not hope. In the weeks that followed my daughter's removal from the hospital, I rebuilt my routines with a calmer, wiser steadiness. I organized my affairs with people who had proven their integrity. I made notes, locked files, and placed my trust only where it belonged. None of it felt bitter. It felt necessary. The final third of a man's life is not about holding on. It's about protecting the years that remain, with the dignity earned from all the years that passed. If there is anything worth offering to anyone who may walk a similar path, it is this. Trust your instincts, guard your documents, and never let kindness replace caution. Love your family, yes, but never hand anyone the keys to your life simply because they share your blood. A man's peace, in the end, is built on the strength of his boundaries, not the hope that someone else will protect what he should have guarded himself.